All right. Going to give people about 10 more seconds. And it looks like Sally and Al, people are right between minimal, but a lot of people are at moderate, it looks like. We have about 70% indicating that they have a moderate amount of knowledge when it comes to this topic area. Great. All right. So that being said, I'm going to switch us on back to our presentation, and we will go ahead and get started with today's webinar. So again, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Trauma-Informed Care and Practices in a CAC setting. And this is the WRCAC's webinar series that we'll be doing dealing with the effects of trauma on children, youth, and families. Again, my name is William Moore with OJJDP's INTAC, and before we begin our webinar, I'd like to take a few minutes to go over some of the technology to keep in mind. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and will be available on our INTAC YouTube channel. You can view past and archived YouTube videos for any type of supporting materials, including the transcript or any additional handouts related to the webinar. You can contact the OJJDP TTA Help Desk. Please note that individuals that are looking to download a copy of the PowerPoint slides and other materials may locate them in the handouts pod that's in the upper right-hand corner. Simply click on the name of the file and then click the download button. During our Q&A portion of today's webinar, we will have an opportunity for you to ask your question. For you to submit your question, simply go to the chat box and type in your question and select enter or hit the little bubble icon there, and that will submit your question. We will get to as many questions as we can during our Q&A portion. For those who are attending, please note that you will receive a certificate of attendance. The certificate will be given to you in an automated email from Adobe Connect. Now, for those of you who are joining in a group, please take a minute to help us count. If you can, go to the chat window and type in the total number of additional people in the room with you today. If you're viewing alone or by yourself, there's no need to type anything at this time. However, if you're viewing with an additional person, please type in the total number of additional people in the room with you today. So for example, if it's me and my mom watching today's webinar, I would put 1 to indicate that one additional person who is joining. I'll give folks just a minute to indicate the total number of additional people that are in the room with you today. No need to type anything if you're viewing alone at this time. And if you'd like a certificate for those additional people, please be sure to fill out the group validation form. This group validation form will indeed allow for you to get a certificate for those additional people in the room viewing the webinar today. Again, if you're viewing alone, you will receive your certificate in an automated email from Adobe Connect. That being said, I'm going to go away and go ahead and turn it over to our moderator, Ms. Sally Kerr, for today's webinar. Sally, take it away.
Thank you, Will. Welcome everyone to the Trauma-Informed Care and Practice in a CAC Setting webinar series that's being produced by Western Regional Children's Advocacy Center. I'm Sally Kerr. I'm a state liaison with Western Regional CAC and am a provider of technical assistance and training within the Western region of the United States. Western Regional Children's Advocacy Center is committed to supporting communities and tribes to develop and enhance multidisciplinary teams and local programs such as children's advocacy centers to allow us to better respond to child abuse and neglect, and at the same time deliver training and technical assistance by strengthening existing investigative MDTs, CACs, and state chapters of the National Children's Alliance in the 13 Western states. This project is being supported by OJJDP and is being hosted by obviously NTAC, and we're thankful for their support as they have helped us host this webinar series. This is the first of 3 webinars in this series. The series will examine trauma-informed approach to investigating child abuse, allegations and responding to child victims. The second will examine ways for multidisciplinary professionals to incorporate trauma-informed practices and skills in the systems that they respond to those children and youth in. And the third will examine the use of a trauma-informed organizational assessment to inform changes the CAC can implement to improve staff skills and services provided to children and families. And the immediate focus of this webinar is on the longer-term effects of trauma on children by introducing technology related to trauma, how adverse childhood experiences, and examine how the professionals on the multidisciplinary team incorporate their knowledge of the effects of trauma into their practices in their disciplines as they respond to child abuse. And so, without any further delay, it is with great pleasure that I introduce Al Killen-Harvey. Al is the co-founder of the Harvey Institute, a training and consultation company whose mission is improving healthcare outcomes through integrating sexual health. For the past 27 years, he has worked at the Chadwick Center for Children and Families, where he has served in a variety of clinical and training positions. Al is a frequent presenter nationally and internationally on a wide range and variety of topics related to children and adolescents, as well as sexual identity and gender identity. He currently serves on the advisory board of the Children's Advocacy Centers of Colorado and is a past board member of California Professional Society on the Abuse of Children. So without further delay, thank you, Al. We appreciate you bringing this to us, and I will let you get started.
Great. Thank you so much, Sally. What a pleasure and an honor it is to be here today with all of you. As is obvious, I am disappointed that we couldn't all be together in the same room, given what is going on in the world, but it is great to see folks logging in on the chat, letting us know where you're coming from, a wide variety throughout the United States and internationally. I saw Nigeria, I saw Guam, saw several other places out there, which is really, really exciting for me. And again, a real privilege to spend some time with you. As Sally mentioned in the introduction, I have for 27 years worked at the Chadwick Center, which is one of the child advocacy centers for San Diego County. So I am passionate about the work that child advocacy centers do and the model that it has brought to help us more effectively respond to issues of trauma for children and families. So today I have a really difficult task, I will be honest with you. In a very short period of time, a little over an hour, I have to somehow figure out how to help us understand several components of a very complex subject matter. So I'm going to set the bar really, really low here and tell you that many of you may leave today's presentation a bit disappointed that we didn't get into all of the levels of understanding of the topic matters that you wanted, and I get that, and I apologize for that. But given the time that we have, I'm going to try to hone in on just several key components of creating a trauma-informed organization, regardless of where you work in the system. And because this is focused around child advocacy centers, I realize there's a wide variety of disciplines represented, and I will try as much as I can to speak to how these different concepts play out, whether you're in law enforcement, you're in the medical aspect, you're in the forensic interviewing, you're in behavioral health, you're in child welfare, you're a child advocate, whatever your role is. We may have some folks in public health or school systems or juvenile justice, all of whom are important components of responding to child abuse, child neglect, child maltreatment. So trying to touch on all of those is going to be a challenge, but we'll do our best and at least lay out some basic information for everyone. As you can see here, I tried to hone down to, okay, what are a couple of doable things in the amount of time that we have? First and foremost, I just want to try to make sure that everybody has a basic understanding of trauma. Now, many of you may already have an extensive understanding of trauma, so bear with me during the first few moments of the presentation, because not everybody does. And that is really, really important, that we all at least have some fundamental concept of what trauma is. Secondly, I want to talk a little bit about, in particular, how trauma impacts the children and the families that we serve. And again, there's lots and lots of places that I could go in that arena, but I'm just going to hone in on a couple of components, some of what research tells us, some of what our anecdotal experiences as folks that worked in the field tell us as well. And then thirdly, I want to talk about how trauma impacts the staff and multidisciplinary teams that work around the arena of child maltreatment. This is the area where there is probably the least amount of focus placed. And I will suggest to you, and I will again later on, that we do this at our peril, that we focus so much of our time on the clients that we serve that we individually and collectively as organizations fail to take into account the impact doing this work has on us and our staff and our organizations. And when we fail to do that, we end up paying a very big price for that. So that's my little teaser to hang in there till the end of the presentation, because we're going to talk a little bit more about that later on. So let's begin and see what we can accomplish here. I want you to think about the disciplines that you represent, where you come from, what it is that you do, what system you work in, the colleagues that you work with as well. I want you to think about, in doing that work, how much are you grounded in trauma? Now, that may seem like a completely ludicrous question to ask, particularly for folks that are working in CACs or other related kinds of fields. But what we find over and over and over again is that other than experience, which is crucially important, for those of us that have worked in the field over time, we know there's nothing like what you learn from actually doing the job. That alone actually isn't enough to do the job adequately. And oftentimes we find that folks have no formal training in trauma, no real understanding of what it looks like, what its effects have been, what folks that have experienced trauma over time collectively tell us about their experiences. That is really important. So I want you to think for just a second about how much trauma information do you have, how much do your staff have, how much do your colleagues have. Play with chat here a little bit. There's a lot of you out there, so I'm going to try to read really quickly. I'm not going to read out loud, but just get a flavor. I'd like to answer the question, have you had any formal training in trauma? Yes or no? Have you attended a class, a workshop? Have you taken a course, a seminar? Put yes or no in the box for me so I can see that. Wonderful. You're already answering and responding. You're out there and listening, and wow, lots of yeses, a spattering of no's along the way. This is awesome. I'm really, really, really happy to see this. Thank you so much. All right, you can keep answering. We'll look at that as we move along. Super important. So for today's purposes, we are just going to touch on some basic understanding of trauma. Again, it will be a review for some folks, and it may be newer information for other folks. So I want to start with a very basic component here to think about. When I say the word trauma, now we're done with have you had the formal training. When I say the word trauma, now I would like you, if you're able to, in the chat box, to throw out the first thought, word, image, idea, feeling, concept that comes to mind for you. When you hear the word trauma, what do you think? Don't filter it, don't screen it, primary process. And I'll try to read a few as you go through. I hear complex, pain, hurt, abuse, harm, ACEs, sadness, experience, repeated, crisis, child abuse, bad experience, distress, long impact. Wonderful. You can keep them coming. Now, what's interesting about that, thank you so much for participating with me on that. What's interesting about that, as I look through it very quickly, and I appreciate you responding that way, is there is a combination of things that are being presented there when I asked about the word trauma. What we see in there are some events, child abuse, domestic violence, sexual abuse. Those are events. What we also see in there are experiences, sadness, pain, distress, hurt. And trauma is actually when we're looking at this, we want to look at both the event and the experience. And oftentimes, we make assumptions based just on the event of what the experience is that an individual has had. So I'll explain that further in a second here. So let's start first with the idea of an event. Slides to move here, if I can. There we go. So a traumatic event. A traumatic event would be something like, oops, sorry, the screen is moving a little fast for me here. A traumatic event would be something like a car accident, physical abuse, domestic violence, a medical process or procedure, an earthquake, a fire. Those are events. Those are things that happen that could cause a traumatic response in someone. Now I want you to listen to that wording again. Could cause a traumatic response in someone. But they don't necessarily always do. And that's why it's really important for us to take a look and have a way to understand the impact on the individual of the event. Just because somebody experienced something that we would mostly consider to be a traumatic event does not necessarily mean that they were traumatized. So let's talk about this a little further. So traumatic events, as I mentioned, can be a singular event, or they can be multiple events. So a singular event, something that generally I've only experienced once, or someone only experiences once, is what we call an acute trauma. Car accident, generally, most of us actually aren't involved in a car accident. If we do, generally a one-time thing. Unfortunately, for some people, it may be more than once, but generally it's a one-time thing. That would be an acute trauma event. Chronic trauma is when events happen over time, repeatedly. That could be the same event. I live in a home where there's domestic violence, and my parents, caregivers, whomever, are hurting, harming each other over and over and over again. It can also be different events that happen, but all traumatic in nature. I live in a home where I was subject to being physically abused by a parent or a caregiver, and then I live in a home where when I walk out the door, there is community violence that occurs on a day-to-day basis where I am. And it could be that I'm also experiencing the pandemic of COVID right now, which is a traumatic event as well. So when there are multiple traumatic events happening to an individual, that is what we call chronic. Now, there can be differences in how people respond. This is important for us, depending on where we work in the system, to understand. And again, we'll talk about experiences in a few moments. But if somebody experienced a one-time event versus chronic event, what we do know is that generally, folks that experience chronic events have different responses over time. There is a sort of getting used to, or a way of responding in familiarity, because I've been exposed to so many events. So understanding the client that you're working with, is the traumatic event that they're here to work with you on, that you're investigating, that you're examining around, that you're the interviewer on, that you're the treatment professional around, is that the only event that happened to them, regardless of whether or not you are going to do any work with those other events? It is always important to understand if the client, the child that you're working with, has any other trauma in their history. That information could be crucial to understanding how they're responding to this particular event. So make sure that you ask about that. You have some formal way of asking, and we'll give you one suggestion as to do that in a few minutes in the middle of the presentation. So I want you to, now Sally is going to do a reflective question for you a little bit, based on a little bit of what we just talked about.
Yeah, so the reflection is, given the range of the ways that children experience traumatic events, how can you or could you change the way you conduct an investigation or respond to an abused child or family that keeps the knowledge of that trauma front and center, or a reaction to that trauma front and center? So some of the ways that we see that impact, or see that impact on children and families, is the impact on child's affect. So as a detective, do you often encounter children whose affect doesn't match what we think that they should as a victim? Are they not crying? Are they flippant? Like, the ways that they would respond, it might be different than what we would view as a victim's response. Diminished trust toward a system, and is the family, do they believe that they're actually going to have a case prosecuted fairly on their behalf? You know, the idea of linear trauma narratives, and do we, as a forensic interviewer, do we have the recognition that children will have a difficult time providing linear timeline? And are we going to be able to include other ways for that child to provide narrative details that aren't necessarily just in a linear response to what happened to them? And as a victim advocate, have you established relationships with other service providers or culturally appropriate services so that the victim, child victim, and their families are getting appropriate referrals to services for them that are culturally appropriate? So those are some of the ways that we take into account from the disciplines in MDT, how we can incorporate trauma responses, our responses as a discipline to trauma experience of children and families.
Great. Thank you so much, Sally. Super important, and I hope you took advantage of that. And Sally will periodically be asking you to just kind of take a moment and let some of this information kind of settle in and percolate, and asking some hopefully thought-provoking questions for you. And so I really appreciate that as an augmentation to this presentation. We also encourage you, if you have questions along the way, again, because we are just giving some general information and not being able to go into lots of depth, feel free to throw your questions into the chat box, and those will be captured, and at the end we will answer as many of those as we possibly can. So now, I've mentioned several times that an event, a traumatic event, does not necessarily equal an experience, and this is really important for us to look at. Let me give you a quick example, which unfortunately is so timely now. I used to do a more abstract example of this, but we have a living, breathing one right now. We all know that we are living now in the age of a major health pandemic across the globe called COVID. I would guess without hesitation that all of us would agree that no matter how you define a traumatic event, that COVID would clearly fit into the category of a traumatic event. I would think there is no question about that whatsoever. Given the case of that, now let's think about the fact that across the globe, we are all dealing with a traumatic event, COVID. Are we all experiencing COVID in the exact same way? Let's throw that into the chat. Why not? You've been so great about that. Is everybody across the globe responding to COVID in the exact same way? It may seem like an obvious question, but go for it. Humor me. It keeps me awake here. No, absolutely not. Thank you. I appreciate that. But it's the same event. So there's a good example for us to realize, even though we are all experiencing the same traumatic event, we are not all having the same response. That is true in other traumatic events as well. So it's important for us to not look at a referral that I get that says, this young person lived in a home with domestic violence. Okay, well, I know what I'm going to get when that kid shows up, because we know what kids look like when they're in a home with there's a lot of domestic violence with parents. I don't know that. I know some generalities. I know some things research tells us that some people experience as a result of living in a home with domestic violence, but I don't know exactly what this child experiences that I'm about to see, or that I'm about to go out on an investigation for, or that I've been assigned as a family support person for. So the event doesn't tell me that. Only the individual can tell me that. Trauma is personal. Trauma is personal. Despite everything else that we're going to show you here around some of the other things that we know about trauma, the number one thing we are sure about is that it is very personal to the individual that experienced it. And our systems and the way that we approach folks that have experienced trauma have to reflect that personality. We can't go in with just general assumptions and treat people as if they are a number in a spreadsheet. It's not true with trauma. And we are going to find just as many kids that don't respond or don't give us what we were looking for as that do. And so trauma is personal. A traumatic stress or a traumatic response, now we are beginning to start to think about experience. You know, what is an experience? How do I know if the event has now caused something that needs more attention? These are just some general definitions, but for me, working language, kind of day-to-day language, is that a traumatic response, somebody that is really experiencing something negative as a result of a traumatic event, it overwhelms their ability to be able to function. Many times the narrative that's very similar that we hear, particularly with youth, is they either say directly or imply or draw for us or communicate in another way that it was almost to the point where they didn't know that they would survive it. It so overwhelms the system. That's a traumatic response. That's traumatic stress. That could be an indication of post-traumatic stress, much more clinical term that would require more detailed investigation. But there's a response there about being overwhelmed. If we were in the room together, I would oftentimes start with some little thing that happened to me in the course of the day yesterday and tell you that I got a little overwhelmed by that, and I then all of a sudden realized that I was having a traumatic response, when in actuality what I was experiencing was probably something minor and was more a dramatic response, a bit more of my drama, not necessarily trauma. So important for us to value and respect what trauma is. I'm of an older generation. I grew up in the 50s and the 60s. Trauma wasn't very much talked about back then. It wasn't part of the lexicon in the way that it is now. The good news is we do talk about it now. We do recognize that it's out there and that it has a major impact. The bad news is that the word trauma has now almost become generic to mean anything that's uncomfortable, anything that bothers us, anything we don't like, anything that just sort of kind of annoys us. That is not trauma. That's drama. We have to respect that trauma is bigger than that. Trauma affects in a much more core element of who we are. And that understanding may then help us understand further why folks respond in the ways that they do. Trauma also happens in a context. This is back to trauma being personal. Again, I can't predict. Even if you gave me all the details of a traumatic event that a child experienced, I can't predict how that child would respond unless I know a lot more about them. And even then, it's going to be a little difficult, but at least their behavior may make a lot more sense to me. So where is that child developmentally? Did that happen when that child was 4 or 8 or 17? What kind of support does that child have? They're a family unit of some sort or a community unit that child has been able to lean on so that when this event happened that seemingly overwhelmed them, they could rely on that for support. What kind of trauma history did that child have? That's really, really important for us. And again, depending on which aspect of the system that you're involved in, have you asked for prior traumas? This may be the key piece to figure out why this child is presenting in the way that they are. Cultural beliefs and traumas are super, super important, and values related to it. How does the community talk about it? Is what's going on here normalized, even though we know that it may be traumatizing to a child? Has it been normalized within a particular community or family system? So trauma happens in a context, and we want to be thinking about, have we treated this child as a complex being or as just a widget that's someone that we have to just get basic information with and move forward? If we do that, we're going to miss key information that's going to cause us not to be able to investigate adequately, not to be able to prosecute adequately, not to be able to treat and support adequately in behavioral health, if we don't know some more details about who this child is and where they come from. One of the more interesting sort of recent, and I use that term loosely, but recent events around trauma is that we have begun to finally get some really great data on how trauma impacts the brain. And this is actually relatively recently that we've done this. Trauma itself, the field of studying trauma, is a very new field of study in the broader scheme of things. Really only in the past 40 or so years, and even that is giving it a little bit, have we really started to look at the issue of trauma and really begin to explore what it looks like and how it impacts people. And now we have technology that is helping us really understand how it impacts the brain. Now, we always thought that it did, but we didn't have real proof of that other than to just sort of anecdotally look at the ways in which children in particular and adolescents respond. But what these studies are now showing us is that trauma can have a profound impact on the brain and on the development of a child. It really can impact the actual brain formation. Bear in mind that our brains are constantly growing and changing. That never stops until the day we die. It's a really, really fascinating organ in our body is the brain. It is constantly adjusting itself to new information and rewiring itself over and over and over again. And what we know about the brain is that those particular parts of the brain that are impacted earlier in life tend to have the most profound impact long term. And so in this field that we're all working with, this is important for us to know, that when children are exposed to traumatic events and have traumatizing responses to that, the potential is there for very serious long-term implications, unless those children can be attended to, identified, and supported. And so that's important for us. Now, the bad news is that trauma impacts the brain. The bad news is that trauma impacts the brain significantly more for younger children. The good news is, as I mentioned, because we know that the brain is constantly changing, that it doesn't mean that all those children now are lost to us because they experienced traumatic events early and it's over. We do also know, with support, with evidence-based sort of interventions, with family support, with community support, with child advocacy center support, that the brain can continue to rewire itself and find ways to heal from the trauma that happened. It can never eliminate it, but it can find ways to cope and be able to incorporate it into how it functions. Many of you have probably heard these phrases before, very simplistic, but I want to put them out there anyway. Typical ways in which people respond to trauma, if they're having a reaction, is fight, flight, or freeze. Now, that's very simplistic. It is a lot more complicated than that, but that helps us a little bit in order to maybe get a sense of when I'm working with a child, when I'm trying to investigate, when I'm doing the forensic interview, when I am, afterwards initially meeting with a child for behavioral health and mental health services, understanding how they reacted to the situation can be really important. For some of our kids, they will immediately sort of push back. This is true for all of us as well. Again, we'll use our COVID example throughout the course of today. As a result of COVID, this traumatic event that all of us are experiencing, some of us are in the fight mode. Some of us are getting more active. Some of us are going out there and exploring the medical research and advocating for what we believe to be the appropriate way to respond so that we can mitigate this. We're fighting against this thing, even though we have this extreme traumatic event happening to us. For some of us, it's a matter of flight. It's like, all right, I'm just going to get out of here. I'm going to dissociate. I'm going to pretend it's not happening. Don't talk to me about COVID. I don't want to know about it. I'm sick of it. I don't want to do that. I want to get away from it all. And some of us just freeze. We just don't know what to do. It's so overwhelmed our system that the things I normally can rely on, the kind of ways in which I respond are just not there for me. And I'm numb. Now those reactions may happen for a short period of time, or they may happen for a long period of time. And this is true for the kids that we're working with as well. That in the moment, they may respond back to that traumatic event, particularly if it was within a family situation. They may try to fight. They may try to get away, or they may be just completely immobilized. All of those are very typical ways that people respond. And so we want to help youth understand that as well. One of the things as a behavioral health therapist for years that I heard was a tremendous amount of shame from kids that experience particularly interpersonal violence, family violence, what we call complex trauma. That idea that I didn't do anything. I just let him whip me with the belt. I just let her get into bed and touch my body in ways that didn't feel okay, and I didn't do anything. They froze. It's a typical kind of traumatic response. But a child doesn't always know that. And a child may feel like they've failed somehow because they should have done something else once they understand that it was wrong what happened to them. They don't always know that, but once we've given them that information. So helping them understand that their response was their response, whatever it was, and that there's no shame in that. But let's understand how you responded, because it will also give you some information for in the future, should other traumatic events happen for you. This is good information for you to know. I'm not going to go into a lot of the effects of trauma exposure. I just want to touch on them a little bit. This gets a little more wonky, a little bit more into the behavioral health side, a little more into the brain waves as well. But I do want you to know, regardless of where we are in the system, the impact that you can have by doing the work that you do, because it does have such long-term impact. We do know that trauma can impact the way that people form relationships over time. Studies have shown us this over and over and over again. So as I know all of you know, so I risk speaking down to you, and I don't mean to in any way. But we know that, you know, a 6-year-old who's experienced physical and sexual abuse, domestic violence, we do know that it is not a matter of good. We find them, we put them into treatment, and a year later they have good effective treatment, they're good to go, and it's all over. This is going to be with them the rest of their lives. We know that. It doesn't have to be immobilizing the rest of their life. It doesn't have to be a barrier from all of the things that they should be entitled to like anyone else, but it's going to be there the rest of their life. So it may have to be revisited periodically as well. So it affects relationships. It affects cognitions, meaning how we think about things, cause and effect. For children in particular, I want you to think about the words power and control. If there's nothing else from today, and I'll probably say that 3 or 4 times because every time I get to a new point, I always think it's the most important one. I'm really bad at gauging these. But this is one of the 3 or 4 most important pieces I want to leave you with, if you didn't already have it. The concepts of power and control. For children that have experienced a traumatic event and have been traumatized by those, these become important navigational tools for them. The very nature of what trauma is. Remember back to our kind of rudimentary definition of traumatic stress. The very nature of it is something happened that you were not in control of. You didn't expect it, you didn't plan for it, you didn't necessarily know how to respond to it, and it didn't feel good. Now, as a result of that, I want you to think about how important being in control now becomes moving forward. Particularly in a child's mind. You know, children are, by and large, quite narcissistically oriented. And I don't mean that in a patronizing way. I love working with kids. I have tremendous respect for kids. That is not a pejorative statement. It's true. They see the world through their own lens. The world is all about them. And that's as it should be. That's how we develop a sense of ego and a sense of self. That's super, super important. The challenge with that is they also, therefore, then believe they are responsible for everything that happens in the world, which is not true. But they don't know that. And so this bad thing happened when I wasn't in control. And so now I've got to be in as much control as possible so that nothing bad ever happens again. So these kids that may have generally been up before these traumatic events happened, fairly easygoing, spontaneous, could kind of go with the flow, now all of a sudden need to know a little bit more about what's happening, need to have a little bit more of a sense of kind of purpose and intention and control over what we're doing. Now I want you to think about this depending upon the roles that you play in your particular organizations. How much power and control can you give the kids that you're working with? This is really important. There are limits. We can't give them everything. They aren't in charge. They also have to recognize that. They are not ultimately in charge of the world. But can we give them a bit more control? Simple things. Can they choose which seat they sit in when they come in to meet me in my office? Do I give them permission to not answer questions that don't feel okay for them? You can say no, or I don't want to talk about it, and I will respect that. Where can I give them an ounce of control? I need to ask you a bunch of questions, and some of them are hard, and some are just sort of general questions. Which questions do you want me to start with? Now, I've told the kid I'm going to ask you all of them, and I've also told you you can say no to the ones you don't want, but I've also given you some control over the process. So wherever you can, no matter where you are in the system, no matter what you do in this system, can you think about at least one or two things that you can do when you're interfacing with a child that gives them some sense of power and control over what's happening? I want to underscore this as well around our multidisciplinary teams. You know, some of the way that we can also give kids power and control is by giving them information about what's going to happen. Now, we have to do that at a developmental level that's appropriate for them. But as a therapist, one of the things that I would hear over and over and over again from kids was, I never knew when somebody else was going to call and want to ask me about what happened with my dad. I thought I was done. I already told one person, and then somebody else called and they're an investigator, and then somebody else called and they're a therapist, and somebody else called because they're the DA, and nobody told me all these people were going to be calling me about all this, and I don't want to talk about this anymore. Can we inform children about what's going to happen, what maybe to expect in their situations? Do we tell them about the court process if they're going through that? Do we give them any orientation to what a courtroom looks like? These are all important components of giving children a sense of power and control, at least limited in terms of what's going to happen once they're in our system, so that we don't add our system's trauma to their already interpersonal trauma that may have happened outside of that. So a little bit of a tangent there. Sorry about that. I'm prone to do those. But I wanted to kind of get that in there, and I hope that that's something that you can pragmatically look at within your systems. The trauma affects us in so many ways, emotionally, physically, and we'll talk about that in a moment when we talk about the ACEs as well, that there are physical responses that the body has as a result of traumatic events that it's experienced as well. So I want to now talk just a little bit about the ACEs study. And again, just to make sure that you're all with me, how many of you have heard of the ACEs, the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study? Just a yes, no in the chat box for me, please, just so I can get a flavor for whether or not this is something that folks are familiar with. I'm going to guess that about 50% of you are familiar with it and 50% are not. Don't go to Vegas with me. I'm not really good at predicting this stuff, but I threw that one out there anyway. All right, so I'm seeing a lot of yeses already, so clearly don't go to Vegas with me. Looking like many of you are already familiar with it. Great, super. I'm going to give one more second for a few more answers in there. All right, so I'm just going to touch on this briefly. For those of you that are not familiar with it, there's no way I can do this incredibly groundbreaking and important project do justice in the couple of minutes that I have here. So I strongly encourage you to Google it, to look up the ACE study. It will come right up if you Google it, Dr. Vince Folletti and what it showed. So with all due apologies to Dr. Folletti, who I have had the good fortune and privilege to know and actually present with periodically because he's from San Diego. Another hometown boy makes good here, at least has done most of his work in San Diego. So with all due respect to Dr. Folletti, in a nutshell, what his work did and continues to do, what his study did just about 30 years ago now, 25 years ago, he is, for the first time, was able, through some interesting work that he was doing non-related to the trauma field, to begin to connect the dots that trauma not only impacts individuals emotionally, but also physically. He was actually able to see long-term physical consequences of individuals, heart issues, lung issues, cancer, diabetes, He worked in the area of folks who were chronically obese, so weight issues and all of the resulting kind of physical issues that are a result of folks that are carrying too much weight. Over and over and over again, what he began to see is that folks at higher risk for long-term physical health issues almost invariably had a history of what he called adverse childhood experiences, what we would call child traumatic events and experiences as a result of it. So the ACE study was groundbreaking to finally say that we've all got to pay attention. This isn't something that kids grow out of, and we don't have to worry about it once they're adolescents or once they're adults. This is for the long haul. We threw this in there, again, not to try to capture all of that work because there's so much in it, but to remind us all why it's important that we do what we do. We're not only helping that 9-year-old child in our office right now, we're helping that child when they become a 29-year-old and a 49-year-old and a 79-year-old. That's the impact we have if we respond appropriately to the traumatic events that they have. What we're doing with them will have long-term consequences in the positive. It will help to mitigate some of what Dr. Felitti found. You know, when Felitti found this, he found these long-term consequences as a result of traumatic events because by and large he was working with individuals who got no treatment for those traumatic events when they happened. They weren't even acknowledged or they were denied by people. And so this is what happens when trauma goes unattended, that it impacts us this way. But Felitti would say, and we would all say, that those are not givens. A child with multiple traumatic events does not have to be predestined to a life that is cut short because of physical illness or because of emotional and mental illness issues as well, if we get in and treat and effectively work. And that's what we're all in here to do, and that's awesome. So I want to take another moment and have Sally join us again and see if we can do just a reflective piece on what we just talked about.
Yeah, so just as a practical matter, as we talk about the effects of trauma, what we want to know is why is it important for MDT professionals to learn common behavior patterns that present themselves in children that have experienced trauma? And taking those into effect, taking those into account as we look at the effect of trauma on children and their resulting behaviors. So as a forensic interviewer, if you know the impacts of trauma on children, is that going to help you during the course of your interview? If the child can't sit or stand or doesn't seem to be focused, are you going to understand that that can be a behavior or sign of a behavioral response to trauma? As a victim advocate, are you sharing materials with parents that show the effects of trauma and behaviors that the parent should expect over the course? And does that victim advocate then later check in with the caregiver to review and ask about the children's behavioral progress? If you're a mental health provider, are you using evidence-based assessments for trauma and reviewing appropriate treatment plans with caregivers to treat that child's traumatic response? And so in many practical ways, as we take into account and understand the effects of trauma exposure, we'll continue to see our responses bring that child into healing.
Great. Thank you so much, Sally. I really appreciate that. So now what I'd like to do is I want to think about our systems and this idea of trying to make our systems more trauma-informed. I'm going to sort of simplify a couple of components. Also for Sally or Will, my screen is freezing a tad, and so I'm not able to advance my slides, and or there's a delay. So one of you would be able to step in, that would be awesome. So we're going to look at a couple of components of trauma-informed care. And one of those is creating this safe environment. That's really, really crucial for us. And so I want us to think about what that may mean in the component of the organization that you all work in. Now, safety is an interesting word. For many individuals, I think we have sort of a narrow understanding of what safety is. And quite honestly, in the field, we've had, up until recently, we've had a narrow understanding of what safety is as well. We've seen safety as being about physically protecting a child, making sure that they are not in harm's way physically in any way. And that is really, really important, for sure. So if I'm investigating a case and there's any concern that that child is being physically harmed in that home, obviously my primary concern is making sure I remove that child from that situation so that they're no longer physically hurt. But what we now know is that there's another component of safety as well that's vitally important for us to look at, and that's what we call psychological safety. So psychological safety is this idea of not only am I physically safe, my body can't get hurt, but what about where I am emotionally? Do I feel safe? Do I feel secure? Am I not worried about where my information might go? There's one aspect for some component of a child advocacy center, depending upon what your job is there. When we talk to kids, do we tell them why we're asking the questions that we're asking? Do we tell them what we're going to do with that information so that they understand that and then don't feel surprised by it later on? This gets back to our issues of power and control, which are in many ways related to a sense of psychological safety. I can't feel safe if I don't know what's going on. One of the things that's been really interesting for me to experience as a behavioral health therapist over the years was when we would, and we still do, when our system removes children from homes because of the threat of physical safety. And again, that's super important that we do that. I don't ever want to undermine the importance of that. But not having acknowledged the psychological safety issue, then we run into a problem. Kids that I worked with many times when I began my therapy with them were not so much motivated at the moment to talk about the traumatic events that happened to them that caused them to be removed from their home. That wasn't the pressing issue that was going on for them. The pressing issue that was going on for them was that they didn't know when or if they were going to be returned to their home. They didn't know where their siblings were. They didn't know if they were going to be able to go back to their school again. That's psychological safety. That emotional questioning and wondering caused more distress sometimes in the moment, sometimes, for some of these kids than the quote-unquote traumatic event that got them into the system. So it's important for us in CACs and other multidisciplinary team members that are working here that we address this psychological safety issue with the children that we're working with. Do we give them information? Do we let them know what's going to happen? Do we attend to their worries and fears and concerns within our system as well? So there is time for another sort of reflection. And Sally, if you're able to, want to take this part, please?
Sure. So one of the things as we talk about CAC accreditation standards and how CACs have embedded in them standards that produce trauma-informed care. And so the reflection is, how do you as a multidisciplinary team design your investigations and interactions with child victim and their families to not introduce additional trauma to the child. And while what we see is that trauma-informed care, things like psychological safety and child focus, is your CAC space a safe place when a child is introduced or brought to the center, and do the supportive caregivers feel safe when they bring their children in? Do your child victim and their supportive caregivers know that what they share will be held in confidence? And can they rely on the CAC staff and other team members to not disclose their information outside of inappropriate way? Do the disciplines that interact with children and their families, law enforcement, prosecutors, victim advocates, interviewers, intentionally build relationships with the child and the family in order to create psychological safety and rapport with that family? Again, right back to what Al talked about families being given consistent information about what is the status of their case, and what is the status of prosecution, and how is that team working together to best serve the child that was a victim of, that child victim. And so we do see that as part of the CAC Accreditation Standards, a lot of those are built into that through the CAC process, but as multidisciplinary teams to just continue to take into account what we are doing with those families and children to not introduce additional trauma.
Great. Thanks so much, Sally. And we apologize, we had a little technical glitch there with the slides, but I think we've got those straightened out, and you are no longer having to look at my face, so there's one less traumatic event you have to deal with today. So that was our way of trying to do some trauma-informed care for you as well. Before we go to this slide, I just want to slide in one other piece, and then we're going to talk about us, which is so crucially important as well. I've made some references, being a therapist, I've made some references to therapy throughout this presentation, but I didn't carve it out as a separate piece to talk about, because it really has to be its own piece. Trauma-informed, evidence-based therapy really needs entirely its own webinar. But I do want folks to be aware that there is such a thing, if you aren't already aware of that. And it is important that in making referrals, no matter where we are in the system, that when appropriate, that we make referrals to organizations, agencies, and providers that are trained specifically in understanding the effect of trauma. This is not something that you just refer over to just a clinician who has a general practice. With all due respect to my colleagues, and I have many of them that have general practices, this is an area that requires specialization. And so does the therapist have any training and understanding in trauma and evidence-based treatment interventions, such as TFCBT, which stands for Trauma-Focused Cognitive Behavioral Therapy. There is CPP, child-parent psychotherapy. There's a whole alphabet soup of evidence-based treatments that are out there. I do recommend for folks that are looking to see kind of where the state is around therapies and whether or not they've been tested and evidence-based around trauma, to refer to the California Evidence-Based Clearinghouse, the CEBC, that's cebc.org, and they have a whole, they compile evidence-based treatments that are out there and let you know how they've been studied, how they've been researched, what languages they're available in, all kinds of things about evidence-based treatment. So the California Evidence-Based Clearinghouse is a great resource for that. Within your own communities, you want to be looking at child advocacy centers. Your child advocacy centers will be your best source of understanding who are the treatment providers, either within the center itself or partnering organizations that can provide evidence-based trauma treatment. But super, super important that somebody have an understanding of what trauma looks like. For too many decades, we had therapists seeing kids with trauma histories who were not trained in trauma and never talked about the trauma with the kid because the kid never brought it up. That's a real flaw in our system here. And with evidence-based treatments, we do bring it up, we talk about it, and we help kids move forward. So, quick plug about treatment and therapy I wanted to put in there. So now let's talk about us. The other component in this whole sort of jigsaw puzzle that we're putting together that up until now, up until recently, has really not been addressed at all. And it's what's the impact that all of this has on us, regardless of where we are in the system. The DAs, forensic interviewers, behavioral health folks, family support people, admins that work in our organizations, transportation aides, anybody, those of you in juvenile justice system, I mean, anybody that works with kids with trauma history, and a lot of our kids have trauma history, over time, we are going to begin to absorb some of that and take some of that on, consciously and unconsciously. And that is really, really, really important for us to take a look at that. So these are some of the signs of what can happen for us over time if we are not taking care of ourselves. Many of you have probably heard some of these terms, and particularly lately, they have begun to just start to be part of more and more conferences and seminars. Things like secondary traumatic stress or vicarious trauma or compassion fatigue. Now, each of these have different sort of meanings, and there are nuanced differences and burnout, but collectively, what they are talking about is the price that we pay over time for doing this work if we're not attending to our own emotional needs. I hesitate to call out any one system because none of us do this particularly well. I will tell you that. None of us do. But some of our partnering organizations may have even harder times around doing this. I am going to name names here, so I'm a risk taker. Our law enforcement partners, I think this is a particularly challenging arena for them. And I've grown to respect and understand why that is. But in law enforcement, it is not a part of the culture to talk about your feelings with your partner, with the other cops on the beat, the other detectives. That's generally not what we do. That's not part of where that culture comes from. And as a matter of fact, there may even be implied in that some sense of weakness or not being able to do the job if you do begin to start to talk about those sorts of things. And I get that and I understand that. And I understand where it comes from. I've been educated a lot by our incredibly wonderful law enforcement partners. But I would still suggest that we've got to find a way to change that culture. And this is not just law enforcement. I just pointed them out as one example. In all of our disciplines, we have to find a way to welcome in a place for us to talk about the feelings of doing this work because we're paying a huge price for it. This is just a list of several, not comprehensive, but several signs that somebody may be dealing with secondary traumatic stress or vicarious trauma. I want you to just look at this list for a moment and think back in the past 6 months. Have you experienced at least 2 of these, or maybe even more? You don't need to answer that, so silent reflection, but look at that. If so, it may be that you are beginning to be dealing with some of the signs of secondary traumatic stress. And how are those addressed and handled? Now, up until relatively recently, we didn't talk about this at all. And then recently, we began to talk about it, recently meaning within the past 10 or so years. And early on in that, this is often what the answer was proposed for all of us. Okay, so now we'll at least acknowledge that doing this work is hard. It can be stressful. It can take an emotional toll on us. So now it's your responsibility to take care of yourself. Buzz, wrong, nope. That is not a full answer. That is a component of an answer. Self-care is not the answer here. It's a piece of a bigger, complex answer. So up until recently, we've been told, okay, if you're feeling these things, then you need to go figure out how to take care of yourself. That is letting our organizations and our field off the hook, and we can't do that any longer. All of us working in this system have to begin to lobby and advocate for that our system has a responsibility of taking care of us, as well as we are responsible for taking care of us. But what is built into the system that does that as well? Don't ask me to just go off and attend to myself, and you, my boss, my organization, my agency, my community, depending on who I work for, have no responsibility when you know that this work is challenging, emotionally draining, and actually can cause many of us to pay a huge price. The organization has to have a responsibility in that as well. So self-care is important. Know what works for you. Some of these things that are on this slide may not work for, any of them may not work for you. Some of them may be wonderful things work for you. That's great to figure out what it is, but find it. Where do you go when you're stressed? Who can you count on? Is that professionally? Do you have a therapist? Do you have a spiritual leader? Is it your partner? Is it your best friend? Is it alone? And by reading and contemplating, there's, like trauma, taking care of the effects of trauma for professionals is also very personal. So what works for one person is not going to necessarily work for you. So you have to decide what works for you, and many times that's by trial and error. So that's the self-care piece, and that's where up until recently we left it. I'm suggesting, and many other people are suggesting, that's only half the equation. So now what we want to do is that we want to start asking our organizations and agencies to begin to kind of bring in their piece of this as well. And we want them to provide us with some support, emotional support around the kind of work that we do. So one of the things that I'm going to talk a little bit about is what's called trauma-informed supervision. I don't want you all freak out here. It's a term that reflects a kind of a bigger sort of gestalt. So don't worry, this isn't just clinical. It's not psychobabble here. But one of the places for some of us in the field that we can get some of the support from our organization is through this reflective supervision. I would suggest that all organizations that work in the trauma field need to learn how to be more reflective in their practice, not just in their supervision. Law enforcement, medical field, behavioral health, child welfare, school systems, juvenile justice, we all need to become more reflective in our process. And what I mean by that is, do we give ourselves time during the course of a day to just take a deep breath and to think about not just did I follow the protocol, did I follow the Welfare and Institutions Code, did I follow the legal parameters around the investigation, did I follow the medical protocol that I was supposed to follow. Not only did I do my job that way, but also what emotional effect did that have on me when I was doing that? I removed that child from the home as I was supposed to do. The criteria was there, it was clear I needed to do it, and I got that child to a safe foster placement for tonight, job well done. That's not the end of it. What did it feel like when I did that? What was it like to actually hold that child as they were crying and have to put them in my car and take them away as they kept screaming, I want to stay home with my parents or with my mom or my dad or whomever? What did that feel like for me to do, even though I knew what I was doing was right? I was doing the process of my job right. But what was the emotional impact of that? Has anybody in my job asked me that? Have I ever been given permission to just say, I'm proud of what I did, and it sucked. I did exactly what I'm supposed to do, and man, I just couldn't get that kid's face out of my head all night. But I know I did the right thing. And boy, it's just sort of gnawing at me. Do we allow ourselves and our partners and our partnering organizations a space to just do that in, reflect on what this job is and the toll that it can take over time? And I really encourage you to kind of think about that. Is there space for that in wherever we go? Now, I've stacked the deck so far because I've been talking about all of the challenges and how much it can emotionally weigh on us. We also know that there can be tremendous rewards and privilege that go with doing this work as well. And so I don't want this training to end without putting that out there as well. There are terms now that you're going to start to hear like vicarious post-traumatic growth. These are great examples of that we also know by being involved in this work, by being so closely connected to children, youth, and families that have experienced some horrific things. Yes, it we may pay a price for that, but we also get access to something that so many other people don't get. There is a privilege in doing this work. There's a privilege in being a part of a place where you can actually help be part of a process that helps a kid. Once again, maybe trust when their trust was shot in adults, because they remember that cop that came out and how sensitive that cop was in asking those questions. They remember that nurse that attended to them in a way and answered all the scary questions that they had when nobody else would answer those questions. We're a part of that. That's a privilege that's hard to describe to somebody that doesn't do this work. Or that moment when a kid has a light bulb moment go off. We said something to them that helps them understand their own experience, helps them not feel a sense of shame any longer, helps them believe that they could be happy maybe again sometime. There's nothing better than that. I hope I'm speaking for most of you, but I think for most of us who do this work, that one moment, and they don't come in all the time, but when they do, we got to jump on those. And those need to be talked about as well. And in my experience as a consultant and a trainer, I find this is an area that is not talked about almost at all. We may give our staff some time to talk about the challenges on the case, or when the case went bad, or when something went wrong. We may allow them to kind of vent a little bit, but we don't talk enough about our success as well, and how that case helped us grow. What we learned from our clients. I've learned a lot from 7- and 8-year-olds. Let me tell you, there is a lot of knowledge in those young folks if you're paying attention and being mindful, and that's cool to be able to share that. So I encourage you to also talk about what's good about what you do, what you get out of what you do, the pride in what you do. We need to own this because many of us work in systems where we're not getting that from anywhere else. Our clients many times, understandably, are so caught in their own trauma that they can't thank us, or they don't have the perspective at the time to know how important our work was. And that's not their job to, and that's okay, and we all know that. But who does, right? Or we may be reporting to a governmental agency, and all we get is when we do something wrong, we're headline news. Do it right, and we have that wonderful moment with that kid, nobody mentions it. It's as if it never happened. So then it becomes incumbent upon us to give that to each other, to celebrate our successes collectively. So I really want to encourage you to own this. With that, I'm going to turn it back to Sally for one last reflection.
Yes, so do members of your MDT not only acknowledge the impacts of vicarious trauma on individuals, but do you have practices built in place to help build resiliency both individually and in the team? Al has already mentioned some of those that in practice teams do. That it's celebrating successes particularly, and not simply just successes of a case or prosecution, but elements within those cases that are really should be celebrated, and successful things learning from, like he said, interaction with someone in a grocery store or a family that you've seen come along, and are you sharing that with your team members if you see the overall picture of success that you can celebrate as a team? You share with your team when you see a family doing well. As a therapist, do you share when the child victim has successfully completed a evidence-based trauma treatment? Like, what kind of things are you bringing to your team? Not just review of cases, but ways that you can impact and celebrate your success that are outside of the prosecution's completion of a case. And how does that help with building resiliency on your team?
Great. Thanks so much, Sally. I really appreciate that. Yes. So we are getting right to the end, and we're going to go to questions. So please make sure you put those questions out there so that we can try to answer them. We have just a minute before we do that. So I just want you all to just think for a second now. I've tried to just touch upon just some key elements. I know it's not been super in-depth, and it's been sort of a smattering of things, but I hope there's been some coherent narrative throughout all of that about the importance of understanding trauma, understanding the effect that it has on the youth that we serve, and understanding the effect that it has on us. And so thinking all the time about what is it that we want ultimately. We can't change that these children were impacted by the traumatic events. We can't do anything about that. That happens by the time they see us. we can do a lot about how they respond to that and how they move forward from it, depending upon how mindful we are in the ways that we provide, the service that we provide, and all of the arrays of disciplines that are presented in today's talk. So really thinking about taking into account the tremendous opportunity we have to impact the long-term health and mental health of the youth that we serve. What great work we do. Thank you all for doing the work that you do, first and foremost. Every single one of you, no matter what that role is in this big system, you matter. As a therapist, I used to hear from kids all the time about who mattered and why, and many times I know you didn't get to hear it, but I did. You matter, even if you don't get to hear it all the time from these kids. And thank you for spending the time with us and for your thoughtful responses. So now we're going to see if we can answer some of the questions that you had. I believe that the PowerPoint is also available for folks, so please access that. My email address is in there, so if I don't get to your question or didn't feel like the right place to ask it, feel free to email me. I will do my best to get back to you as soon as possible, but I will get back to you. I promise you that. All right, Sal, I'm going to throw it over to you for questions if we could.
Okay, great. Thank you. So we have received a few questions in the registration process, and one of the questions we saw kind of as a theme throughout the registration process was, what do you think the service provider should take into account when dealing with the effects of historical trauma?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really great question. Again, because of time, we didn't get to talk about all the different ways that we understand trauma. And historical trauma is a really, really important one to look at. I mentioned at the beginning, I think it is important to find ways to ask about trauma history for a child and for their family. And historical trauma is an important one. So the child may not have experienced other traumatic events, but their family may have experienced other traumatic events. And those will ultimately, the science shows us, those will ultimately trickle down to the child. So if my family, even generationally preceding me, multiple generations, trauma is passed along many times within families by the stories we tell, by the ways it changes our lives, and then it's modeled for the next generation, even if they don't know where that came from. So historical trauma is crucial to explore. Has your family, your culture, the community that you identify with, is there a history of trauma for any of them? And if so, might that also have been kind of passed along to you so that it adds to your challenge around dealing with this particular traumatic event that's now present? So thank you so much for that question. Super, super important. And again, deserves its own webinar, historical trauma and cultural trauma for sure.
Mm-hmm. Another theme was, in what ways can juvenile detention and probation facilities, what ways do they contribute to the trauma, and how can they work to prevent continuing to bring additional trauma within the system of juvenile detention and probation?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. And I noticed in the check-ins early on that several people identified as coming from that system, and there's probably lots of you on here. First, I'm so glad that you're here. And I'm again, with any one system, I'm sorry that I couldn't tailor the talk just to each one. Quick response is get a trauma person, a trauma expert to come in and do some training with your organization. You've asked a really big question that's got a really big answer to it. Each system would have to look at how are we responding now, in what ways have we taken trauma into consideration, and in what ways have we maybe unconsciously caused more trauma because of the ways that we operate within juvenile detention. I think all of you that working in juvenile detention already know the statistics show us that kids with trauma histories are disproportionately represented in the juvenile justice system. Again, it's part of the ACEs thing. It's the long-term effects of childhood trauma. And one of the things that we know is that our kids, when they are not treated for these traumatic events and the responses they have, end up coping in other ways and trying to make themselves feel better in other ways. And some of those ways end up putting them right in the line of doing something that crosses a line, and they end up in juvenile detention centers completely overrepresented there. Those centers can exacerbate the traumatic events by being insensitive to that. By not recognizing, again, imagine you have huge issues around power and control, and now I'm incarcerated. Imagine emotionally what that's got to be like for you to try to deal with all of that. I was physically abused by my dad, and he would hold me down all the time. And now, in order to move somewhere else, I may have handcuffs behind me and somebody pushing me in a direction that I don't want to go in. even though that's what that person has to do as part of the member of the team there, for me as the kid that experienced that traumatic event early on, that may present for me flashbacks from my physical abuse from my father, when somebody else made me do something I didn't want to do and I had no control over it, and I just explode. So understanding that the responses of kids in juvenile detention may be direct mirroring of their traumatic histories, and do we have ways to look at that? But it's a complex question. I really appreciate asking that, and it really deserves partnering with somebody that knows trauma in your arena and have them start to look at your system, your procedures, and your protocol with a trauma lens and make suggestions to you of places that they think that you can adjust to be more trauma sensitive. But each system's got to do that personally, because I can't say what's exactly in there. But I'm glad that you're curious about it, and I encourage you to do that. Thanks for the question, and thanks for being here.
Another question, Al, is what recommendations, do you have recommendations on evaluating if a program is implementing trauma-informed practices? I want to be sure we highlight how you look at evidence-based.
Yeah. There are lots of organizations that have put out sort of guides to or assessments around whether or not we are trauma informed. For folks that are looking for particular tools that may do that, like surveys that can be given to an organization to assess whether or not they are trauma informed. Again, you can look at the CEDC, because some of that is there. The California Evidence-Based Clearinghouse will have some of those tools. I also encourage you to shoot me an email and Sally, and we can send you some of those as well. So email us if you're looking for a specific tool related to that, and because there are several out there. It depends on the nature of your organization and what you're looking for, but there are ones that will give you an opportunity to just do a general survey and say, are we in the ballpark here of making sure that our services are trauma informed? So there's lots of good stuff that's out there.
Another question is there a difference between vicarious and secondary trauma and being triggered by your work because of your own ACE score?
Yes. Yeah, we didn't get into all the details, but there are differences between vicarious trauma and secondary traumatic stress, and and there's arguments as well about what those differences are. So I won't get into all the semantics about all of that, but I'm going to try to harvest what I think is the bigger question that you're asking there. Regardless of what we call it, what we do know, two things that we know. We know that in this arena of child maltreatment that we all work in, that a preponderance of us have our own trauma histories. No surprise. Consciously or unconsciously, there is a reason why we're doing the work that we're doing. And many of us are doing this work because we have our own trauma histories. So that's a given. The research has shown us that. That's true in child welfare. It's true in behavioral health. It's actually even true in law enforcement. And so it's important for us to know that we come with our own trauma histories. What we also know about secondary traumatic stress, vicarious trauma, whatever you call it, is that we are at higher risk for those happening to us as adults and working professionals if we have a trauma history that has not been attended to. So if I took the ACEs, if I now realize I had multiple traumatic events that happened to me as a child, and I have not processed that at all, I've not dealt with that, that puts me at much higher risk for secondary traumatic stress, to take on the trauma of the clients that I'm working with, the kids that I'm investigating, the kids that I'm seeing in treatment. I'm much more likely to have that happen for me if I haven't addressed my own. I'm also much more likely at times to blur the boundaries between working on what the kid needs and working on what I need unconsciously if I haven't done my own homework around that. So I really do encourage you, if you've done something like the ACEs, and bear in mind, the ACEs is wonderful, but the ACEs is not a comprehensive screener for trauma history. It tells us some interesting information, but there's a lot of things that are missing on the ACEs around traumatic events that can happen to children. It also has some limitations around culture. It does not talk about community violence and other sorts of traumas that are very specific to some populations, but there are better screeners out there for trauma. So I encourage you to meet with a professional if you're interested in looking at your own trauma history, and that will better inform you and put you in a better position to be able to do this work over time. But there is a direct correlation between our trauma history and developing secondary traumatic stress. So thanks for asking.
Mm-hmm. We have two questions I'd like to get to in the next few minutes. So the first one would be, how can schools support families who have experienced trauma?
Yep. Great. I'm so glad that schools were represented here. I'm going to do a quick answer, and then also, again, if you want to email me, I'd be happy to try to provide some other support. Another organization I didn't push earlier, and I should have, is the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, the NCTSN, the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. It's a federally funded through SAMHSA, Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Association, a collective of organizations and agencies across the United States working with issues of trauma. They have tremendous information. It's all free of charge because it's federally funded. You can go on their website, and there's all kinds of aspects and information and fact sheets and information sheets and tip sheets and things you can give parents and things you can give your client, things you can give professionals around all aspects of working with child trauma. And they have an entire committee that's working on trauma in the schools. They have curriculum for schools around how to address trauma. They have assessments to see whether or not you're a trauma-informed school. So the nctsn.org is a great website that has that. And there are many other organizations, including the ACEs Connect and other organizations that are working with school systems as well. So if you don't find what you need there, email me and Sally, and we can connect you to other organizations that are specifically looking at trauma in the schools. And that is super, super important. Our kids spend the vast majority of their time in schools or these days interfacing with school personnel. They are also our biggest source of referrals to trauma treatment is school personnel, so they are crucial to this. They are the eyes on these kids that many times would get otherwise never noticed. Thank God for teachers, nurses, school counselors, administrators. They are how many of our kids get to our treatment. So lots of resources out there for them. Thanks for being here, and thanks for asking that question. Try to get one more in, Sal. Let's do it.
One more, and we thought it was a really interesting question when we came in, and that is, what are there positive effects of trauma?
Absolutely, absolutely. Watching kids heal, watching kids rebound, watching kids that have experienced the most horrific things. And you look at that and you think, okay, first of all, a sense of perspective on my own life. Oh my God, look at what this 7-year-old is putting up with, and I'm going to complain right now about some of the stuff I'm going to complain about. Talk about humbling me on a day-to-day basis. Working with kids that are moving through this humbles me every single day and allows me to be much more grateful about the things that I have and the life that I have. And watch kids fighting through, determined to have a life that they should have. Watch them tell the hard stories and do it with such courage. That gives me courage to be a stronger, braver person. When I get scared and afraid, I think about some of the hard work that the little kids that I worked with have done. And it's like, I have no place to be scared and afraid. If they can do it, I can do it. And then I think about the people that I work with, including all of you on this call today. The people I work with in every discipline represented here, law enforcement, DA, nurses, doctors, social workers, child welfare workers, family support advocates, administrators, policymakers, juvenile justice. I am so honored to work in a field with each and every one of you because of your dedication to making sure that this world becomes a safer place for kids. And that's a privilege as well because we work in this field. So with that, I'm going to end and thank you all again so much for what you do. Thank you for being who you are. Thank you for the difference that you make in kids' lives. And thank you so much for carving out just a little bit of time in a crazy, crazy world these days to spend with us. What a joy and privilege it's been. And let us know if there's anything else more that we can do. And please thank the folks that put this together, William and the whole team behind them, our closed caption person, who I don't know how the hell they have captured all that I say because I talk so fast. Thank you to all the support people that put this together. It takes a lot to put one of these together, and they have been just awesome. So a real privilege. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much for that, Al. I really do appreciate that that compliment there. And to our audience, we do have up the the slide here where you can see both Al and Sally's information if you'd like to reach out to them as well. I know some people were inquiring about maybe email addresses, Al and Sally, so went ahead and put this slide up here for folks. And again, the slides are indeed located in the handouts pile where you can download them and get access to them as well. But before we wrap up, for those remaining, just a couple of last-minute items here just to cover for you all. First of all, if you'd like to get in contact with OJJDP's INTAC, you may do so on the at the address here, and you can sign up for our listserv where you can actually get access to our TTA listserv where you can learn more about webinars like this. You can also find us on Facebook at OJJDP TTA. If you'd like to get in contact with OJJDP, you can go through the OJJDP Help Desk at the phone number and the email address here. For those who may have had any issues with downloading the handouts, you can I put the email address in the chat a few times, so you can reach out there and we'll be more than happy to assist you with any assistance that you need there as well. Do you have a training or technical assistance need? Well, if so, be sure to submit a TTA help request via the OJJDP TTA 360 platform. You can access it through the URL on this slide where you can submit your training and technical assistance request. Again, for those on here, please note that this webinar is being recorded and will be available on our YouTube page. You can click on the link here that says INTAC YouTube where you can view some of our archived webinars. For the transcript and any supporting materials, please reach out to OJJDP TTA at usdoj.gov. And please note, I did see some people ask about the upcoming webinars related to this series. Please note that these webinars are indeed coming up this month. The registration is live for each of these. Oops, looks like my slides went away there. Hold on one second. Let me pull those back up. Here we go. All right. So please note that these slides are indeed, these webinars are indeed live, and you can go in and actually feel free to register for them. And then we also have a couple of webinars with our colleagues at the Innocent Justice Foundation where you can go and register for them as well. And you can access or get more information about those here. We also have a couple of webinars with our colleagues with Zero Abuse that are coming up this month. Please feel free to go in and you can register for those here. And finally, before we wrap up, we do have a quick poll question that we'd like to know. Did you have an increase of knowledge from attending this webinar? So when you can, go in and go ahead and select the options here and let us know, did you have an increase of knowledge? The options you have here are no, my knowledge did not increase. Yes, my knowledge increased a little, or even my knowledge increased a lot. So you have options here where you can go in and you can let us know, did you have an increase in knowledge from attending this webinar? I'm going to leave this up for about maybe a few more seconds since we're running a little bit over before we go into our final poll question here. And thank you all for answering that as they're coming in. Great, great. All right, I'm going to go ahead and end that poll, and then here's the final poll here for you all. And the final poll that we have is, how do you plan to apply the information from this webinar in your work? You can go in and you can select multiple answers here. Just take your mouse and click on the boxes next to the options that we have here. Feel free to select multiple options here on this poll and let us know, how do you plan to apply the information from this webinar to your work? Again, I'm going to leave this up a little bit for folks as you all file out of the virtual room. Feel free to go ahead and answer this question. But again, I want to thank our presenters, Sally and Al, and our colleagues, of course, at WRCAC for a wonderful webinar. And thank you to our audience for attending this webinar. We look forward to having you on the next webinar. Thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful afternoon. Goodbye.
The host has left the meeting. So at this time, the meeting will come to an end. Thank you and goodbye.